In the year 2000, one company was so dominant that it didn't just compete in the mobile phone industry, it practically defined the industry itself. At its peak, nearly 1 out of every 2 mobile phones sold on Earth carried its name. This was not just market leadership, this was industrial supremacy. Nokia was not merely ahead of its rivals, it was the system, the benchmark, and the giant everyone else was trying to catch. But the same dominance that made Nokia look untouchable also made the company dangerously confident, and that is exactly why its collapse shocked the world. Nokia was not just a corporate success story, it became a national economic force. In Finland, this one company accounted for roughly 4% of the country's GDP, 21% of its exports, and around 70% of the Helsinki Stock Exchange. Think about how insane that is. A single corporation became so large that the health of an entire nation partially rose and fell with its performance. Nokia was no longer just a business selling phones. It was a pillar holding up an economy, a stock market, and a national identity. Then came the collapse, and it was not a gentle decline, it was a financial wipeout. By 2012, Nokia's stock had crashed by roughly 98%, falling to around €1.33 a share. A company once worth roughly $250 billion had been shattered. The same firm that once sold hundreds of millions of phones a year now looked broken, confused, and cornered. So what happened? Was it really just the iPhone? Was it really just Android? Or is that version of the story far too simple? Most people think they already know this story. Apple released the iPhone, Google backed Android, Nokia was slow, clumsy, and obsolete. End of story. But when you actually examine the evidence, that explanation starts to feel dangerously incomplete. Nokia was not killed by one rival product. It was destroyed by something more corrosive: internal fear, technical paralysis, bad incentives, and a leadership culture that made honesty feel dangerous. This is not just a story about disruption. This is a story about self-destruction. To understand how huge Nokia's failure really was, we first need to understand just how strange its success had been. Nokia did not begin as a glamorous technology company. It did not start in Silicon Valley. It did not begin with software. It started in 1865 as a wood pulp mill on the banks of a river in Finland. That alone should tell you something important. This company had survived because it knew how to transform, and yet, at the moment it mattered most, it failed to transform again. Over the next century, Nokia evolved again and again. It moved from wood pulp into rubber, then into cables, then into electronics. At one point, the company was involved in everything from boots to tires to industrial wiring. This constant reinvention was part of its DNA. Nokia was not born as a specialist, it became one. And that's what makes the later collapse even more painful. Reinvention had once been its greatest strength, but eventually that strength gave way to rigidity, politics, and fear of disrupting the machine that already worked. The defining turning point came in 1992. Jorma Ollila became CEO and made one of the boldest corporate moves in modern European business history. He looked at Nokia's sprawling operations and decided to bet the company on one future: digital mobile communication. He sold off the old businesses and focused on phones. It was a radical gamble. If he was wrong, Nokia could have shrunk into irrelevance, but if he was right, the company could own the future. And for a while, that is exactly what happened. The gamble worked. Nokia launched the 1011, the first commercially available GSM mobile phone, and then kept accelerating. It didn't just participate in the mobile revolution, it became one of its main architects. While competitors were still figuring out what the future of phones might look like, Nokia was scaling manufacturing, learning distribution, and dominating global markets. It was fast, focused, and disciplined, and in a hardware-driven world, that formula was nearly unbeatable. Nokia understood the phone as a physical product better than almost anyone else alive. Then came the icons. The 2110, the 5110, the immortal 3310. These weren't just gadgets. They were cultural objects. They were durable, familiar, and trusted. The Nokia 3310 alone sold roughly 126 million units worldwide. Later, the Nokia 1100 would sell over 250 million units, becoming the best-selling electronic device in human history. That kind of scale creates something dangerous. It creates the illusion that what made you powerful yesterday will keep making you powerful tomorrow, and that illusion would become one of Nokia's deadliest weaknesses. Nokia's strength was physical. It knew manufacturing, it knew logistics, it knew how to produce durable hardware at scale and push it efficiently across the globe. It also understood design psychology. Phones were not just communication tools, they were becoming lifestyle accessories, with customizable covers, durable bodies, and distinct personalities. Nokia dominated the physical object, but hidden inside that success was a fatal blind spot. The future of the phone was slowly shifting away from the body and into the software. And Nokia did not move fast enough. On January 9th, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage and introduced the iPhone. At first glance, it looked like a beautiful piece of hardware. But that description actually misses the point. The iPhone was not simply a phone with a better shape. It was a pocket computer built around software, touchscreen, apps, interface, ecosystem. Those were the real weapons. The center of gravity in the mobile industry had just shifted. Most of the world didn't fully understand it yet. Nokia definitely didn't understand it deeply enough. Inside Nokia, the first reaction was not panic. It was dismissal. Engineers tore the iPhone apart and judged it through Nokia's existing worldview. To them, it looked expensive, fragile, and impractical. The battery life was weak. It would not pass Nokia's tough drop test standards. It lacked the robustness Nokia believed real consumers wanted. And, in a narrow hardware sense, they were not entirely wrong. But they were asking the wrong question. They judged it as a device instead of recognizing it as a platform. That mistake changed everything. And here is the part most people miss. Nokia was not ignorant of touchscreen technology. In fact, Nokia's own research teams had developed touchscreen smartphone prototypes years earlier, as early as 2004. The company had the ideas. It had the technical imagination. It had seen pieces of the future. But those ideas stayed buried in labs and presentations. Why? Because the internal financial data said the current machine was still working beautifully. And when the machine is printing billions, uncomfortable ideas become easy to ignore. Success became a sedative. The numbers fed the illusion. At the end of 2007, Nokia still controlled roughly half of the global smartphone market, while Apple had less than 5%. In 2008, Nokia sold 468 million phones. That was its most profitable year ever. Think about how intoxicating that must have felt inside headquarters. When you are moving nearly 500 million devices a year, it becomes incredibly easy to confuse scale with invincibility. The company looked healthy, the charts looked strong, but underneath the surface, its operating system was already becoming a liability. The mobile war had changed from a hardware contest into a software ecosystem war. Apple understood this. Google understood this. Nokia did not fully understand it in time. It still believed the center of value was manufacturing, supply chain efficiency, and handset engineering. But the new battlefield was apps, user interface, developer tools, and software agility. The phone was no longer just a product. It was becoming a digital ecosystem. And Nokia's software foundation was far too weak to compete in that kind of war. The game had changed. From 2007 to 2013, Nokia absolutely knew that smartphones were an existential threat. This is important. The company was not asleep. It was aware. It held meetings, built plans, launched initiatives, and debated strategy. So why didn't awareness lead to an effective response? Because awareness alone means nothing when the culture of the organization prevents truth from moving freely. Nokia had recognized the danger, but internally it had also built a system that made confronting that danger extraordinarily difficult. They saw the fire, but could not organize the escape. One of the two fatal forces inside Nokia was toxic culture. Top leadership demanded aggressive product timelines and ambitious progress reports. But the software side of the business was in much worse shape than those leaders wanted to hear. So middle managers found themselves trapped. If they told the truth, they risked punishment, humiliation, or career damage. If they softened the truth, they could survive another quarter. That is how broken institutions rot from the inside. Not through one lie, but through thousands of survival-oriented distortions that slowly become normal. Researchers later describe this kind of environment using a phrase that should terrify any investor: pluralistic silence. Everyone beneath the top knew the software platform was not competitive. But because each layer feared delivering bad news upward, the truth was filtered and diluted on its way to the boardroom. Problems were framed as temporary. Delays were framed as manageable. Weaknesses were framed as progress. By the time top management saw the numbers, they were often looking at fiction disguised as control. And fiction is deadly when the market is moving fast. There are even documented accounts of supervisors instructing analysts to manipulate development charts so they looked healthier than they really were. Imagine that. One of the most powerful tech companies in the world was making strategic decisions based on internal dashboards that had been cosmetically improved for political reasons. This was not just miscommunication, it was a governance failure. Nokia's top leadership did not simply misunderstand the battlefield. They were being fed a manufactured version of reality. And when leaders act on fake reality, the consequences eventually become very real. The second fatal force was technical debt. Beneath the political fear sat a software architecture that was simply too old, too tangled, and too slow. Nokia's operating system, Symbian, had been built for an earlier era of mobile devices. Small screens, physical keypads, limited interfaces. It was not designed for the fluid, touch-driven, app-centered world that was now taking over. The company was trying to remodel a crumbling foundation while competitors were building new houses from scratch. That difference in foundation became a difference in speed. Unlike iOS or Android, Symbian lacked the modular flexibility needed for fast modern development. Every time Nokia created a new phone, engineers often had to branch the code and create another specialized version of the software. That meant fragmentation, incompatibility, complexity, and delay. Instead of one strong software platform improving over time, Nokia kept generating more internal complexity. It was building phones on a software swamp, and every new device made the swamp deeper. More models did not mean more strength. In software, it meant more chaos. The productivity gap was shocking. On modern systems, compiling C++ code can take seconds. On Symbian, Nokia engineers reportedly dealt with compilation times of up to 48 hours. Let that sink in. 2 days just to compile a build. And when an engineer wrote even a simple patch, it could take weeks before the result was tested on a live device. In a high-speed software war, Nokia was moving like a trapped giant dragging chains behind it. The company had resources, but it no longer had speed. This is the part many collapse stories leave out. Strategy is useless without execution speed. Nokia could have made the right diagnosis and still failed because its software machinery was too slow to react. By the time code was compiled, tested, and integrated, the market had already moved again. Apple and Android were iterating like speedboats. Nokia was trying to turn a freight ship in a hurricane, and with every quarter, the gap between awareness and execution grew wider. Nokia didn't just lose vision, it lost agility. By late 2010, the situation had become too severe to ignore. Nokia's board removed its CEO and hired Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive, to engineer a turnaround. From the outside, this looked like decisive action. Bring in a fresh outsider, shake up the culture, make the tough call. But turning around a collapsing giant is not just about energy. It is about choosing the right direction under pressure. And soon, Elop would make the single most controversial decision in Nokia's modern history, a decision still debated today. In February 2011, Elop sent a company-wide memo that would become infamous. He compared Nokia's situation to a man standing on a burning oil platform in freezing waters. Stay put and burn, or jump into the unknown and take your chances. It was powerful language. It was dramatic. It was honest in one sense because Nokia really was in deep trouble. But that honesty came with consequences. Once you publicly declare your current platform dead, you have to be very careful about what comes next. Nokia was not careful enough. Elop's answer was not Android. Instead, he chose to partner exclusively with Microsoft and bet Nokia's future on Windows Phone. On paper, the logic was understandable. If Nokia joined Android, it risked becoming just another hardware maker fighting Samsung and others in a crowded field. Windows Phone promised differentiation. It offered a chance to stand apart. But strategy is not judged by how elegant it sounds. It is judged by whether it works. And this one would prove catastrophic. The theory made sense. The market did not care. What made the decision even more painful is that Nokia still had an internal alternative. MeeGo, its in-house operating system project, showed real promise. The Nokia N9, one of the first major devices using MeeGo, was praised by reviewers for its design and user experience. There was finally a glimpse of what a serious Nokia software future might look like. But instead of nurturing it, leadership effectively abandoned it. One of the company's most promising escape routes was cut off by its own hand. That is the tragedy. Then came the real disaster. By publicly announcing that Symbian was dead, long before Windows Phone devices were ready in meaningful numbers, Nokia destroyed confidence in its current products. Why would consumers buy a Symbian phone if they had just been told the platform was finished? Why would carriers push it? Why would developers build for it? Nokia had set fire to its own sales engine before the replacement engine was installed. The result was predictable and devastating. They jumped, but they had not built the landing zone. The market reaction was brutal. Nokia's smartphone share fell from around 24% to roughly 14% by late 2011, and then kept dropping until it hit around 3.5% by late 2012. That is not a decline. That is a collapse in real time. Consumers left. Carriers lost confidence. Developers ignored the platform. Investors watched in disbelief. Every structural weakness inside the company was now visible externally, and the market responded with the only verdict that matters in capitalism: rejection. Once belief disappeared, momentum disappeared with it. And when the Windows Phone devices finally arrived, they entered a market that had already been claimed. Developers were building for iOS and Android. Consumers had already chosen sides. The app stores that mattered were thriving elsewhere. Windows Phone was not entering an empty arena. It was entering a battlefield after the alliances had already been formed. Nokia had chosen a platform without critical ecosystem gravity. In modern tech, that is like entering a war without ammunition. The hardware could be good, but the ecosystem was too weak. The stock price told the story in one savage number. Nokia shares, which had once traded around €65 in 2000, sank to roughly €1.33 in 2012, a 98% wipeout. For investors, employees, and for Finland itself, this was not just another tech disappointment, it was a destruction of belief. The company that once looked immortal had become a warning. Market dominance, huge volume, and national prestige had not protected it. In fact, those things may have made the blind spot worse. Greatness had made danger harder to see. In September 2013, the inevitable happened. Nokia sold its devices and services business to Microsoft for roughly $7.2 billion. Pause on that for a second. A company that once controlled nearly half the world's mobile phone market, a company once valued in the hundreds of billions, sold its phone business for what felt like a salvage price. This was not a glorious merger. It was an exit. The king of phones had effectively surrendered the battlefield it once ruled. The brand survived, but the consumer empire was gone. And then came the cruel twist. Microsoft eventually realized that owning Nokia's phone assets did not solve the real problem. Without a strong app ecosystem and developer momentum, the hardware meant little. In 2015, less than 2 years later, Microsoft wrote off roughly $7.6 billion and eliminated around 7,800 jobs. In plain English, they were effectively admitting that the acquisition had failed. The asset that once symbolized mobile dominance had become almost worthless in strategic terms. It was one of the most brutal endings in modern technology history. If the story ended there, Nokia would simply be a cautionary tale about corporate arrogance. But it didn't end there. Underneath the consumer phone brand, the parent company still owned something valuable: telecom infrastructure, towers, networks, backbone systems, the unglamorous but essential plumbing of global connectivity. And here is where the story becomes unexpectedly interesting. The company that failed in the visible consumer market still had a chance to reinvent itself in the invisible infrastructure market. Nokia lost the phone in your hand, but not the network behind it. Nokia used the Microsoft deal proceeds to strengthen that infrastructure future. It bought out Siemens' share of their joint network venture and then made an even bigger move, acquiring Alcatel-Lucent for roughly 15.6 billion euros. That deal also brought in one of the most legendary innovation assets in telecommunications history, Bell Labs. This was not a nostalgic attempt to revive old glory. It was a serious strategic repositioning. Nokia was rebuilding itself around networks, not handsets. The company that had missed the smartphone ecosystem was now betting on global connectivity. This is one of the most important lessons in the Nokia story. A failed business line does not always mean a dead company. Sometimes the public sees the collapse of the famous brand and assumes the entire organism is gone, but beneath the headlines, assets remain, capabilities remain, and if leadership reallocates capital intelligently, a wounded company can reinvent itself. Nokia failed spectacularly in smartphones, but as a broader corporate entity, it still had tools, cash, history, and infrastructure relevance. The phone empire died, but the company still had a pulse. Today, Nokia is no longer trying to be the phone in your pocket. Instead, it is helping build the networks that carry the world's data. It became a major player in telecom equipment and 5G infrastructure. In other words, Nokia moved from being a visible consumer brand to becoming part of the invisible architecture of modern digital life. Most people no longer brag about owning a Nokia device, but many are still relying on Nokia systems without even realizing it. That is a quieter kind of power, but power nonetheless. And in 2025, Nokia found itself linked to another major technological shift. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang announced a massive investment tied to Nokia and AIRAN, the idea of embedding artificial intelligence deeper into cellular network infrastructure. That means the same company that lost the smartphone war is now helping shape the backbone of the next wave of communications technology. The irony is extraordinary. Nokia failed to own the consumer future, but it may still help power the infrastructure future. The company missed the smartphone moment, but not every future door closed. So what actually killed Nokia's phone empire? Not one iPhone launch, not one Android update, not one CEO memo. It was the combination of success-induced blindness, internal fear, and crippling technical debt. The company saw enough to know danger was coming, but not clearly enough to act effectively. And once the truth inside the company became politically expensive, the path to recovery narrowed fast. Nokia wasn't destroyed because nobody saw the future. It was destroyed because the organization could not honestly face it. That is the real warning. That is the final lesson of Nokia. Market dominance is never permanent. Hardware brilliance is not enough when the battlefield moves to software. And the most dangerous thing a company can do is create a culture where bad news becomes harder to tell than good news. Nokia once connected the world, but in the end, its refusal to confront reality disconnected it from the future. The empire fell, the company survived, and the autopsy remains one of the clearest business warnings of the modern era. If you value pragmatic, data-driven deep dives into the real mechanics behind corporate empires, hit subscribe. We'll see you in the next documentary. If you enjoyed the story of how Nokia went from #1 in the world to near collapse, then you'll love the story of inside LVMH, the luxury empire that owns the world's biggest brands. Click the video on your screen now. I'll see you there.